Do you believe in God?
Define God.
So I came across a video yesterday from an interview on the radio show called The Breakfast Club. They were interviewing Arian Foster, who was an NFL running back that played for the Houston Texans and the Miami Dolphins, but now he's pursuing a career in music. Now, towards the end of the interview, the topic of atheism came up, and he claimed to be an atheist and gave the reasons for his views. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. So, you guys ready? Then let's go!
Let me ask you a question. Do you believe in God?
Define God.
Because I'm reading here, they said that you were raised Muslim, and then you later on said that that's not where you wanted to be, in more of an atheist.
Right.
So what do you believe in?
It's a loaded question. I believe atheism gets misrepresented a lot. So atheism is it's not an assertion that there is no God. It's a position on the claim that there is a God, right? So if you tell me there's a God, I just say I don't believe it. So it's not like I'm saying there is no God. So I'm not of the I'm not of the belief that there is a God.
So what do you believe in?
Tupac, he already told you. What's wrong with you?
Well, it's like when you say, what do you believe in? It's like, I believe in a lot of things. I believe, I just don't have not an opinion. I don't take the position that there is a higher power. It's not something that's like, I don't pray to the atheism God. You know what I mean? It's just a lack of belief. Everybody's an atheism with respect to everything except for their God, right? Like, you don't believe that Thor is a real God, or Zeus.
No,
or
Charlamagne
Mithra.
Believes in Black Panther. He might believe in Wu-Tang.
I mean, as he
Why
should.
wouldn't I believe in Thor or Zeus? Why wouldn't I believe in Thor or Zeus? What's wrong with Thor or Zeus? And Loki?
You think they really up there?
Nah.
Sending lightning bolts?
Nah, I think they existed at some point in time. And I think that over time, stories get exaggerated like they tend to do.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Martin Luther King Jr. will be walking on water in another 20 years.
Well, that's what I feel. That's what I felt what happened with Jesus and Muhammad. And like, maybe the historicity of them can be attested to a certain extent, but as far as the divinity, we have no evidence of that. So I just live my life like that.
I mean, look how we talk about Tupac now. Like, he faked his death, and he was, he's going.
But that's a conspiracy theory shit. Like, you got to check that.
He was about to be the next Malcolm X, so the government took him out. Like, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, it gets crazy. The game of telephone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, can we hear you spit before we get up out of here?
So now the first thing I noticed is that his views seem to have definitely been influenced by online atheism and probably Ricky Gervais, because just about everything that he said are slogans that I've heard over and over again, and I've heard them come straight from Ricky. But let's go through his claims one at a time and unpack them a little bit. So now here's his first claim.
Atheism gets misrepresented a lot. So atheism is it's not an assertion that there is no God. It's a position on the claim that there is a God, right? So if you tell me there's a God, I just say I don't believe it. So it's not like I'm saying there is no God. So I'm not of the I'm not of the belief that there is a God. Well, it's like when you say, what do you believe in? It's like, I believe in a lot of things. I believe I just don't have not an opinion. I don't take the position that there is a higher power. It's not something that's like, I don't pray to the atheism God. You know what I mean? It's just a lack of belief.
So Arian says that atheism gets misrepresented a lot as the view that there is no God. So to be clear, he seems to be saying that being an atheist doesn't mean that you believe that no God exists. Well, that leads to the obvious question of, what do we call people who call themselves atheists, but they do believe that there is no God? What do we call my friends over at Real Atheology, or really every atheist modern philosopher religion that I can think of? They all believe that atheism is the belief that God does not exist, and they call themselves atheists. And even more, when they're asked about this, they point out how those who hold the view that atheism is just a lack of belief in God commit logical errors by doing so. So a fair question could be, who's actually misrepresenting who? Well, maybe I can help clear up some of the confusion. So the view that atheism means God does not exist and is holding to affirm that position that God does not exist is the way that it's been historically understood, and it's still understood to mean that by the vast majority of people in academia. However, more recently, and almost exclusively online, people have changed the definition to have atheism mean something like only a lack of belief in God, which makes the distinction between agnosticism and atheism even more confusing, and leading people to start defining themselves as agnostic atheists and so on. But that aside, this still leads to the more interesting question of what possible motive would people have for changing the definition of atheism from being God does not exist onto something like atheism is only a lack of belief in God? Well, to me, it seems pretty obvious that the main motivation would be to avoid a burden of proof, since whoever's making the claims have the burden. So by redefining atheism in an invalid way, they no longer have to defend the claim that God doesn't exist. But I've already done a few videos on this already, and so have a lot of other people. So to see more, just go ahead and click down in the description where I place some links down there. And let's move on to his next claim.
Everybody's an atheism with respect to everything except for their God, right? Like, you don't believe that Thor is a real God, or Zeus.
So what do you think is the point of his claim here? I think the point that he's trying to make is that we can understand what it's like to not believe in all the other gods, so we should be able to understand why the atheists don't believe in our God as well. Well, this is a little awkward because according to him, atheism is only saying, I don't believe you, and it isn't saying that the claims that these other gods exist is wrong. Well, first off, I don't just lack belief in those gods. I believe that they don't exist, and I don't have any problem given the reasons why I don't believe these gods don't exist. I've also done this in other videos. So when he defines atheism as just saying, I don't believe you, he's not really helping me understand how he feels about my God. Anyways, let's just keep it moving.
Why would not believe in Thor Zeus? What's wrong with Thor Zeus? And Loki?
You think they're really up there?
Nah.
Sending lightning bolts?
Nah, I think they existed at some point in time, and I think that over time stories get exaggerated like they tend to do. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Martin Luther King Jr. will be walking on water in another 20 years.
Well, that's what I feel. That's what I felt what happened with Jesus and Muhammad, and like maybe the historicity of them can be attested to a certain extent, but as far as the divinity, we have no evidence of that. So I just live my life like that.
And it just got a lot weirder than I expected it would. Did Charlamagne really just say that he thinks that Zeus and Thor existed, implying that they were people who walked on the earth at some point, and then in time their stories developed into legends? And then did Arian agree and say that he thinks that something similar happened with Jesus, and that the historicity of all of them can be attested to a certain extent, but we just don't have any evidence of their divinity? Is that what I just heard? Yeah? Okay, so I wasn't just tripping. Okay, all right, good. Just making sure. So let's start with Zeus and Thor. So when it comes to them existing as regular people whose stories later got developed into legends, and the history is attesting to this, I literally have no idea what they're talking about. As far as I know, we don't have any evidence for the claim that Zeus and Thor ever walked the earth as regular people at all. So I don't know where they're getting their history from. Virtually all historians agree that Jesus really did come and walk the earth. So when it comes to the historicity of those like Zeus and Thor, putting Jesus into the same box is an obvious category error. Now in the clip, Charlamagne said that give it another 20 years and people would be saying that Martin Luther King walked on water. And he seems to be saying this hyperbolically, at least I hope he is. But if we did take that seriously, we can calculate from the time of his death, which was about 40 years ago. So that would mean that within 60 years of his death, we would have stories of Martin Luther King walking on water. But we don't see any stories like that now, and even if we did, historians wouldn't take them too seriously. So why is that? Well, one reason that historians wouldn't consider this to have happened is because the earliest accounts that we have of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, they don't include supernatural things happening or any accounts of him being divine or performing miracles or anything like that. Now, when we consider the earliest accounts that we have of Jesus' life, we have him claiming to be divine, performing miracles, and raising from the dead. And by the way, we have Paul citing a creed that shows that the first Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and the creed traces back to just a few years after Jesus' death. So from our earliest sources, we see that the first Christians already believed that Jesus really did resurrect from the dead. Now, we'll just consider the worst case scenario and say that we didn't have anything like the creed that Paul cites. And instead, the earliest sources and accounts that we have of Jesus' life and his resurrection, his divinity, all of that was only found in the Gospels, which were written later. Would we then be justified in discarding those also? Well, we'll get to that point in a sec, but to be clear, yes, there were legends about Jesus that developed over time, but the legends came a long time after the accounts of Jesus' life that we read about in the New Testament were written. And you can read what these legends look like if you read the Gnostic Gospels. But bear in mind, I also want you to understand what it means when people say that they can't trust anything that was written in the Bible. What they don't realize is that the documents in the New Testament were historical letters, biographies, and so on that were just historical documents. They were just given an account of Jesus' life, death, and and resurrection. And it wasn't until later that they were all collected by the church and put underneath the cover called the New Testament. That's when they became part of the Bible. So to treat them suspect because they're in the Bible just shows that a person doesn't understand the historicity of the New Testament or how these documents were established. But with that in mind, let's keep it moving.
Look how we talk about Tupac now. Like, he faked his death, and he was, he's going.
But that's a conspiracy theory shit. Like, you got checked that.
He was about to be the next Malcolm X, so the government took him out. Like, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, it gets crazy. The game of telephone.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Now, can we hear you spit before we get up out of here?
Okay, so they end with a comparison of the telephone game, which is a game where someone whispers something in someone else's ear, and that person whispers it into another person's ear, and that goes on until the last person repeats it back, and then everybody finds out that it sounds nothing like the initial message. This is what they seem to think accounts for why they believe that there's legends about the life of Jesus. The reason why they think this is because between the time of Jesus' death until the time that the Gospels were written down, the accounts of Jesus' life were passed on to people verbally. Now, hearing this objection really makes me wonder if Arian really has looked into the historical evidence at all, or if he's just relying on common cliches that he's heard online. To a person that hasn't looked into any of this before, they may be wondering, how is it that passing on the Gospels isn't just like the game of telephone? Well, there's plenty of reasons, but I'll just give you 3 here. Now, first, I want to say that this objection makes perfect sense when we think about this from our culture today and what we value as reliable documentation of history. But when we think about other cultures, we get reminded that what are considered important communication methods differ based on that culture's needs. So think of it this way. When I was little, my mom made sure that I could repeat her phone number back to her easily in case of an emergency. And in that time, it was super important for me to be able to recite her phone number by heart. So we would practice it over and over until she was sure that I had it down. And it wasn't just hers. I had everyone in my family's phone number memorized because we didn't have cell phones back then that stored our numbers for us. Yeah, welcome to the Stone Age. So anyways, now fast forward until today, and you'll see that I have the hardest time ever even trying to remember my wife's phone number. And the reason why is because I don't need to recall it from memory in order to call her since it's programmed into my phone. So having kids memorize phone numbers was something that was stressed when I was little, but it's not something that's stressed much today. So with that in mind, think of the culture that we're in today. Today, we're in a written culture, which is largely how we get important news and information out to people. In schools today, we spend a crazy amount of time teaching kids how to read and write because of the fact that we're in a written culture. But the culture that the accounts of Jesus' life came from, it wasn't a written culture. Instead, it was an oral culture. And in oral cultures, important information was mainly passed on through careful memorization, and people were trained from an early age to be able to recite large blocks of detailed information accurately. So for example, children were able to memorize large books and large blocks of text like the Iliad or the Odyssey, and it wasn't uncommon for kids to have the entire Old Testament memorized by the age of 14. And if you haven't looked at a Bible lately, here's how big the Old Testament is. Another thing is that a lot of people didn't know how to read and write back then, not only because they were in an oral culture and there wasn't much of a need to do so, but also because the scrolls to write on were extremely expensive. Today, paper and pencils are so cheap that it's easy to teach our kids to read and write on paper since we can produce books easy and we can discard paper without worrying about it. But this would have never happened in that culture. The second point about this is the telephone game is a game where people whisper something in someone else's ear, and by the end, the message is distorted and doesn't resemble what the initial message was. Now, as they said, legends take time to develop, so you have to have enough time.
Over time, stories get exaggerated.
It gets crazy. The game of telephone.
And by the way, we have Paul citing a creed that shows that the first Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, consider the situation that the gospel reciters were in. The stories were being repeated over and over, and as we just talked about, memorizing details carefully was critical in this culture. When it comes to these sorts of messages and things like this, the accuracy of what's being recited and passed on was taken extremely seriously. Josephus even said that Jews could recite the Jewish law easier than they could recite their own names. And because these stories were repeated so often, it's not as though a reciter could just insert brand new miracles into the story without anyone noticing. These stories of Jesus were repeated and presented to large communities over and over for years consistently, so they could be corrected if they messed up or got something wrong. And this was also done in a time and place where eyewitnesses could call them out on it if they lied about something, or if they added something, or if they got something wrong. They would be able to discuss it with the other eyewitnesses who were there. And unlike the telephone game, they didn't just hear and recite the stories one single time. Now, think about this. If you hear something over and over, even in today's culture, we know what it's like to memorize something like music without much thought or effort. Personally, I have at least hundreds of songs memorized, which is an insane amount of information when you think about it. And now imagine in a culture where those who believe these stories consider them to be the most important news and information that they could possibly memorize. So even in this way, it's nothing like the telephone game. And lastly, there's even more evidence found in the text that shows that they strictly held to preserving the accounts accurately rather than allowing for changes or additions. And one way that they did this was through memory structures that we find in the text. Memory structures were structures that were used for memory enhancement, and so we know that they were intended to be memorized reliably. So, in summary, they weren't a culture that relied on the reliability of transferring information verbally, so writing stuff down wasn't nearly as impactful and important as giving the stories to people verbally. They were also more than capable of doing so because they were trained to memorize large blocks of information from an early age, and they also had accountability among each other to be sure that they did so reliably. So, in short, the gospel reciters reciting the stories of Jesus were nothing like the telephone game. Now, of course, so much more can obviously be said about these topics, but we'll have to save those for another time. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that I'm wrong and the telephone game really does resemble the gospel reciters of that culture? Or do you think that I'm right and the telephone game really doesn't at all? Let me know your thoughts down below. But the next time that someone thinks that they're making some really good points by using the same played out slogans that they got from comedians online, what are you going to say?